What I want to do is I want to introduce each of the panelists, but I want this to be very interactive also, right? So that we're not so prescriptive. I think as you hear them talking about their area of work and what they've been doing, it should elicit some interactions and questions from you, and I'll just be monitoring that. I think we have a good hour and 10 minutes for this discussion, and again, I'll be your timekeeper. I'll help keep the conversation moving and flowing for us. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce each one of our panelists. I will read part of their bios and then go ahead and kind of set the frame for discussion just to get us going. And then hopefully, organically, it'll just kind of interface and interact with the rest of you. Sounds like a deal? Fantastic. So we have Doug Bloch, who has been political director at the Teamsters Joint Council 7 since 2010. And in this capacity, he's worked with over 100,000 Teamsters in Northern California and the Central Valley, as well as Northern Nevada, in a variety of industries. He was at the Port of Oakland campaign director, Change to Win, from 2006 through 2010, and a senior research analyst for SEIU International 1877 from 2004 to 2006. Our next panelist that we have is Sheheryar. Pronounce the last name for me. Kaoosji. And Sheheryar is founding co-executive director, has been leading the research and organizing and warehousing industry in the Inland Valley since 2008. Sheheryar leads the research and policy and analysis for the organization, as well as the Warehouse Worker Resource Center, Civic Engagement and Community Organizing Program. And I had the pleasure of meeting Sheheryar a couple of years ago down in LA. So maybe some of that work will come up in this discussion. And then to my far right is Steve Viscelli. He's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a Robert and Penny Fox Family Pavilion Scholar and a senior fellow at Kleinman at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. His research focuses on labor and energy and freight transportation, and in 2016 he published the book The Big Rig Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream, and about the work and fortunes of long-haul truck drivers. His current research is on the impacts of self-driving on the labor movement and the environment. So, welcome. So I'd like to begin by just kind of framing the discussion around a larger theme related to the role of labor's engagement that supports workers and articulating policies and initiatives that promote good jobs for workers. I think that's really kind of the big theme here. As we've heard from some of our panelists this morning, talking from a larger perspective around how do we set standards to ensure that during this climate transition that we are ensuring that workers have good standards in place for them to ensure that they are not only sitting at the table in terms of their needs and understanding their needs, but really what are we doing from a policy perspective to ensure that during transition in supporting climate change that workers are at the forefront. So if I'd like to open that up, I'm going to start to my far right with Steve to open up and talk about some of the work you're doing.
Okay, great. Thanks. So it's a real pleasure to be here. My work really focuses on the labor process and the work that people do as it's actually done. And so my interest in this, and I think the tie-in for me is really thinking about how the jobs that will remain in freight transportation. We have some that may be lost due to automation in the future, but the jobs that we will have for the foreseeable future, the efficiency of those jobs is understanding why they're efficient or why they're not is actually critical to achieving the state's goals. And so there are a whole range of issues that impact whether or not workers who work efficiently that are tied directly to whether they have good jobs or not. And so the trucking industry has a wide variation in the quality of jobs that are out there. And so in long haul, for instance, which is where I've spent quite a bit of time studying, we have lots of situations where workers are misclassified employees who are owning their own truck, and so the costs of fuel and other things are paid for by those workers, as well as the cost of any investments in clean technology. And so it's really critical that we understand that the climate policy is going to have an impact on those workers potentially, but also how those workers work is fundamental to understanding how we need to change the system in order to achieve our climate goals. And I think a really important example of that is at the ports, obviously, where we're talking about investments in technology that we're going to want to maximize the return from. And so we have workers who currently may be using trucks at some ports that are former over-the-road trucks that are quite inexpensive for those workers to buy, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 trucks. And the kinds of trucks that might replace them and be really energy efficient will cost likely as much as 10 times as much as those trucks. And that's going to fundamentally change the economics of freight movement to move to something like a zero emission vehicle. It's going to change the basic cost structure of providing service. So we're going to want to consider those things, not just the impacts on workers, but how good jobs aren't just an afterthought, but they're actually a foundational consideration for whether or not we can achieve our goals. In long-haul trucking, again, one of the key considerations is worker experience. And this is one of the things that is probably the lowest hanging fruit that we have. Some estimates suggest that experienced drivers in certain kinds of operations can be up to 30% more efficient than a new driver. And so these are huge gains that we could have for some of these long-haul trucks, which burn well over 10,000 gallons of fuel a year in many cases. And we could have a 30% efficiency gain by having much more experienced trained workers than new workers. Instead of doing that, we have an industry, which many of you may know, is constantly clamoring that there's a driver shortage because of the poor working conditions and pay. And so cycles through tens of thousands, sometimes more than 100,000 workers a year just to fill its seats. And much of that turnover is subsidized by public training dollars that go into supply, help to fund the supply of workers that are going into these high turnover operations. And so, one of the things that we want to think about doing is not subsidizing the turnover of truck drivers, but then significantly reduces the efficiency of the industry. And so I think if we start from the perspective of understanding that, at least in this industry, it's a service, and the emissions that we're talking about are being produced by, in the state of California, 1 million or so workers are really responsible for most of these emissions on a daily basis. It's the work that they do that produces these emissions, and we have to understand, why do they work the way that they do? Why do they use the equipment that they do? How are they compensated, and does that affect whether or not they idle their trucks, whether or not they bring their trucks home at night, whether those trucks are used on 2 shifts versus 1 shift? And what does that, tell us about the ways that we can maximize, say, the state's investment in clean vehicles? And I think I'll probably leave misclassification up to Doug in particular around those issues. But I think that's how I would start us off.
Before I let you move on to our next speakers, I do want to note that, Steve, you also just completed a report called Driverless Autonomous Trucks and the Future of the American Trucker. And in that report, you speak very candidly about autonomous vehicles in that they are in the future, and that we need to start wrapping our minds around that. Not from like my original stance was denial. I just can't think of autonomous vehicles coming in and the impact on workers is negative, meaning no jobs. But in this report, you said we need to actually start to shift our minds on how we think about emerging technologies, including autonomous vehicles, in order to position ourselves differently, in that we need to be sitting at the table, we need to be having direct discussions with the industries that are looking to adopt and make those type of changes. Can you talk a little bit about why, and then we can transition into our other two panelists?
Yeah, so I think to zoom out even just one step further, I think it's really important when we're talking about freight to understand that we're really at a period of historic change right now. Probably unlike anything we've seen since deregulation of the industry. And it's being driven by a number of different factors, one of which is the potential for new technologies. I mean, we have the sort of holy grail of self-driving trucks with no drivers in them for the industry. But before we even get there, we have lots of technologies that have been evolving and increasing the productivity of drivers and changing the way that they work, like satellite-linked computers and other things like that. We also have really dramatic shifts happening because of e-commerce and growth in last mile delivery. The way that people are getting the stuff that they're buying is changing in a fundamental way. Right? The era of the big box store, to one degree or another, is ending. There's some legitimate debate about that, but we're seeing changes in freight movement that are going to fundamentally shape how we get the stuff that we consume. And a lot of those trends are potentially in the opposite direction from where the state would want to go in terms of climate policy, for sure, around last mile delivery, where we're going to see an increase in vehicle miles traveled, but we're also going to see much less efficient operations. That individual package going to your door, rather than that 40,000 pounds of whatever showing up at the warehouse and then going to the big box store. These are going to be much less efficient operations. They are also the areas where we have some of the biggest labor concerns. And so a lot of these last mile jobs tend to be very low paid relative to some of the better jobs that are out there in long haul, which are the ones that are at risk. In my analysis, it's the better paying long haul jobs that are actually at the greatest risk of being replaced, simply because this technology is going to be good at driving highway miles. And so those jobs tend to be some of the highest paid. Now, some of them have some really tough working conditions as well, but drivers, particularly those from rural areas, do those jobs and work long hours to bring home a family supporting income. So what we're looking at potentially is losing some of those better paying jobs and creating a lot of local jobs. And the risk of those local jobs is that, one, they already pay low wages, but we're starting to see some important challenges to the dominant model with some gig delivery services, things like Amazon Flex and Amazon's new delivery service provider model. And these things really threaten to lower wages and working conditions even further than they are in local delivery jobs. And so there are some real concerns, and again, that's directly tied to efficiency. The difference between a UPS package car that has a couple hundred packages efficiently routed by UPS, which has the assets and volume to really maximize the efficiency of that service. The difference between that and a couple dozen Ford Focuses with 20 packages stuffed in the trunk, where the worker's paying for the fuel and all that stuff. I mean, these are fundamental considerations for how the labor process and the quality of jobs ties into meeting our climate goals.
Steve, you have to plug the website to see
Yes.
the report. Everybody needs to read this report.
Yes.
Driverlessreport.org.
Yeah, it's great.
Driverless report.
Driverlessreport.org.
Right. And I think the other piece about this report, which I want to kind of plug also, is you set up a number of scenarios for how autonomous trucking and or these deliveries of movement of goods across the nation can potentially, what they could potentially look like. And I think those scenarios, there's a rationale behind, because I kept reading, and after the third scenario, I was just so impressed and enthralled to see, wait, there's a fourth, there's a fifth. I think there's 6 different scenarios that you present. Can you give a little bit of background about the framework for why those scenarios were important?
Yeah, the overall goal, and first let me plug, the Labor Center and Working Partnerships USA that sponsored the research. And so many thanks to them for making it possible. But, you know, the broader idea of the scenario forecasting is to get us out of this mindset that there's some inherent outcome built into this technology. That the technology is, you know, we're just going to let it run its course in some, you know, natural process, and we'll end up with whatever self-driving truck would be most likely to come out of that process. And I think having the different scenarios and seeing the different approaches that companies are taking and that they envision as possibilities for how this technology might develop or be used, you start to see all the points where it intersects with policy and with the interests of other stakeholders, whether it's, you know, people who are, you know, designing and building roads, or workers, or communities concerned about air quality, or whatever it might be. I think when you start to see the wider possibilities for this, it suggests, hey, maybe we can shape this thing. You know, maybe we can start to say, not what's the inevitable outcome of this, but what are the goals we have for freight transportation? You know, do we want a more efficient system where we don't have double parking in front of our houses or apartment buildings, and we don't have, you know, high levels of air pollution and childhood asthma, and where we have good jobs, and where, you know, workers have regular schedules and good pay and benefits and stuff, and how can we actually achieve that? You know, could we envision a scenario and harness this technology to achieve it?
Fantastic. I'd like to move on to you, Doug, either in response to some of the work, or I can frame something else, so it depends what you have.
Well, I think I want to talk about the misclassification thing. And I'm really happy to be on this panel because I've done work over several years with every single person here, including many of you in the audience. So it's great to be here. And let me first preface my remarks by giving you a list of all of the polluting, dirty industries that Teamsters work in. As you said, I represent more than 100,000 Teamsters and 23 locals. By virtue of all the years that we were not affiliated with the AFL-CIO, we work in every industry because we rated everybody. And so I deal with 15 major industries in my area. So let me give you some examples. So we drive dirty diesel trucks, dirty diesel buses. We represent locomotive engineers and track maintenance away employees for every coal train, every crude oil train, every nasty anything that's moving by freight rail is being driven by a Teamster. We don't actually work with the cows, but as soon as milk from these polluting dairy farms in the Central Valley gets put in a truck, it's a Teamster driving it to a big dairy processing plant where we turn it into cheese, whey, powdered milk. We are at the ports, we're in the refineries, we work on all the pipelines for the oil. We're in all the giant warehouses and food processing plants. I mean, I think you're starting to get the picture. That being said, we also, especially up here in Northern California, have very high density in solid waste and recycling. So all these green trucks that you see, Waste Management, that are being powered by natural gas that's coming out of the composting process, those are Teamsters that drive that. We do the composting work, for that matter. We drive, and mentioned UPS, the largest collective bargaining agreement in the country, over 250,000 workers. UPS has a very green fleet that's being driven by Teamsters. In my area, over in Livermore, we have over 500 Teamsters at a bus manufacturer called Gillig. It's the last 100% made in the USA, union-made bus company. We made a ton of hybrid buses under the Obama stimulus plan. They've been beneficiaries of California Compete tax credits, where we're using state money to invest in good union jobs. They're starting to make electric buses. So we're not all dirty, but at our core, we are a transportation union. And that's important because 70% of the freight in this country still moves by truck. You know, we started out as a union of horse-drawn carriages, okay, driving carriages. And in response to Steve's thing on the automation, in 1907 we elected a general president, Dan Tobin, who said to our membership at a convention, the motorized truck is not a passing fad. That in fact, we needed to go out and organize these companies with their trucks, and we needed to go to our employers in the carriages with the wagons and tell them that they needed to start buying trucks and training our members on how to drive them. So part of the reason why we were supporting the work that Steve's been doing is we're doing the same thing in response to these changes in technology. And it does relate to climate change because as we grew as a union primarily of truck drivers, we had the first master agreement in the country, the National Master Freight Agreement, which at our peak, we were the largest union in the country, and there was no non-union trucking in the United States. The rates that the carriers were allowed to charge to move freight from point A to point B, they could not charge anything for less than the actual cost of fuel, of truck, and of Teamster wages and benefits. But in the 1980s, under President Carter and the Democrats, trucking was deregulated. It was a series of bills, the final one being what's called the F-Quad A. And if you want to know anything about the F-Quad A, talk to David Rosenfeld back there. But essentially what it did was it deregulated trucking and took away that guarantee of it started the race to the bottom of people competing to get freight by doing it cheaper. And of course, the biggest portion were the labor costs. So out of deregulation comes the phoenix that rose from the ashes was this model of hiring drivers as independent contractors instead of employees. Well, an independent contractor has to buy his or her own truck. They have to pay for the gas. They have to pay for the maintenance. They have no workers' comp, no benefits, no nothing, no right to organize a union, because as soon as I talk to Sheheryar and say, how much did the boss give you to take that container to Stockton? I got $50. We've committed an antitrust violation under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed to keep the railroads from colluding with each other, and now is being used to keep immigrant truck drivers at our nation's ports or over the road, or Amazon Flex drivers, or Uber drivers from being able to organize and actually fight for a living wage. The reason why, and I'll keep this part brief now, is that I can talk about it more later. This morning we heard one of the panelists say that we can't talk about climate change without talking about job quality. We can't talk about job quality without talking about unions. And Steve mentioned the ports, and I see Roxanna's here from Lane. You know, the ports to me, and we have somebody from the Port of LA, and I could spend an hour talking about the ports, and Sheheryar could too. But very briefly, the last wave of environmental regulations that came through this state, I see Bill here, and the environmental movement put us at the very forefront trying to clean up trucks because of the impact of diesel particulate matter on fence line communities. But as Steve said, the people who own those trucks, and the ports are where old trucks go to die, the people who own those trucks are hired as independent contractors, and they are the least equipped to be able to afford new technology. And so I'll keep it here. We can get into details more later. But we have created a system where the taxpayers, through bonds or through air districts or through ports, have essentially subsidized some of the wealthiest corporations in the world, like Walmart and Home Depot and Target, who move goods through our ports, to pay the cost of cleaning up the fleets because the truck drivers are hired as independent contractors and cannot bargain, cannot form a union, and cannot require the trucking companies themselves to shoulder the costs and pass those costs on to the fleet owners. And I'll keep it at that, but later we should talk about what LA tried to do and the fight that we're at right now around a Supreme Court ruling at the end of last year, the Dynamics case, which really gets to the heart of this misclassification.
Thank you for that. And again, this can be interactive, so if you have questions, I'll just keep going unless there's a burning desire to ask a question. Yes, David.
Could you just say a little bit more about the thing that's going on right now in LA that you just mentioned?
The Dynamics? Yeah. So the old standard for whether somebody could be classified properly as an independent contractor was called the Borello test. I'm not an attorney, okay? I'm an organizer, but it was set down by the Supreme Court. And a group of workers for a freight company, a package delivery company that competes with UPS called Dynamics, sued under the grounds that they felt like they were improperly classified as independent contractors instead of employees. The case went all the way to the California Supreme Court, who handed down a ruling last year that established a new test called the ABC test, which exists in 21 or 22 other states, and which the Teamsters and the California Labor Federation wanted to pass through legislation during Jerry Brown's first administration, but Uber was just too powerful at that time for us to get the legislation passed. And Uber uses this model. There's nothing new or sexy about Uber. It's still a misclassified driver behind the wheel. It's just they have an app. And so Democrats all in Sacramento are like, oh wow, that's innovation. You know?
It's tech now.
Yeah, it's tech. There's nothing innovative about it except the money they have. So anyway, so this new test comes down called the ABC test, and it's 3 prongs. But the one that kills them all is prong B, which says if the worker is engaged, if this is the company's primary line of business, then they are an employee. So for a trucking company or for Uber, who would probably argue, well, we're not a transportation company, we're just an app developer. Most lawyers think they're very legally vulnerable on prong B. They all went to the legislature, to the governor, Uber, the Chamber of Commerce, asked the governor to take the extraordinary step of putting a stay on a Supreme Court ruling. And the governor said no. And then they went to the legislature and asked for a special session, and the legislature said no. And they're going to be back there as soon as they go back into session, asking to get this ruling overturned, because it's going to make it, they have some protections from arbitration agreements, but it's just going to make it a lot harder for a small broker that calls themselves a trucking company at the Port of LA to misclassify their workers as independent contractors anymore. Dynamics is what it's called.
So this is a good thing.
It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
It was like, for all the bad news we've been getting, the heavens opened up, and this Dynamics ruling dropped from the heavens and was a gift to the labor movement and to workers in California. So yes. How's that for a dramatic response?
And I'm David Wall, UC Berkeley, Goldman School. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And then Sam.
Can I ask for a clarification on what the strategy is now after Dynamics, for what you're looking at in terms of using that ruling?
Well, first and foremost, we have to protect it. We have to protect this gift. And I think, and we're hoping, and we're going to try to help workers to use it, to sue. You know, I don't even know how many claims have been filed in LA Long Beach. Yeah. How many claims?
Probably by now over 1,000.
Yeah.
And so this is just additional fodder for what Lane has been doing for the last 6 or 7 years, including 3 years where I was there. Really taking rulings, not just, these are all pre-dynamics rulings that were made by the California Labor Commissioner and then eventually other agencies, including the NLRA, NLRB, and EDD, saying that the port drivers are employees under the Borrella test, or the old test. They were being considered employees. There was pretty much a perfect record at the Long Beach office that every time a court case was brought, those drivers were found to be employees. So the companies didn't have to do anything about it. They could take it to court, they could appeal. They have a lot more money than the drivers or anyone else. So it was really kind of a strategy of taking those cases, but also organizing drivers to take action. NLRB found that these drivers are employees, so they started organizing and taking action together. They don't have to deal with the antitrust issues. They started going on strike. They started slowing down freight, and a significant number of them have forced their employees through brute force as much as legal force to change their models. It hasn't changed the entire port, but so this ruling will add on to that. I think it's going to help bleed over into the Ubers of the world, which again we've got a couple rulings on Uber in California, but it's not kind of what we have at the port. The Amazon Flexes as well. There's a need for that. So these rulings don't just make a company change their models. It's not nearly enough. So it's just one more thing that's going to create a lot more liability for these companies and maybe potentially threaten some of their investment. But it's a chip away. But like Doug said, it's also something that's extremely volatile. This ruling is exclusively related to meal and rest breaks and wage and hour law. So under some interpretations, like these workers are employees under wage and hour law, and then under workers' comp, for instance, they're contractors, which is insane and fundamentally unstable. So they're going to have to pick a side, basically.
And part of the problem too is that looming over all of this is this threat of federal preemption. This has been the problem with deregulation from the very beginning, and that is the agenda. I'll say one other thing because I want to slam somebody in front of all of you that deserves to be slammed. That is the agenda. The Ubers of the world is to push for deregulation. And the person I want to slam is that the Western States Trucking Association in California sued to try to get this court ruling overturned. And they represent trucking companies. They sued the state of California because the ruling came down from the California Supreme Court. That puts the Attorney General, Javier Becerra, it's his responsibility to defend the state. The Teamsters, since we've been fighting this deregulation issue for over 30 years, filed a motion to intervene to help the state defend because we feel like nobody has more expertise in this issue around trucking and misclassification than the Teamsters. And unfortunately, the Attorney General did not agree with us and filed a motion to oppose us intervening in the case. And that's all I wanted to say.
I just want to emphasize what's at stake here in terms of the broader issue of misclassification and getting clarification on what the status of these workers is. And in long haul, I've worked on a number of cases, and there are hundreds of thousands of workers who've been subjected to these schemes. I see workers every day in the work that I do in these cases who have been convinced to take on the cost of a $150,000 truck, will work 80 to 100 hours a week, spend weeks, sometimes months on the road, When they return home, the overhead cost of that truck, which can be increased obviously because of policies that make the truck cleaner and more efficient, when they return home, they could work 40 or 50 hours in a week and end up owing money to the company that they work for. So this misclassification, getting them deemed to be employees makes them eligible for minimum wage. And that's, literally what these long haul cases are about, is getting them deemed employees so that they don't have to work 40 or 50 hours for free. Now, if you think that that does not set the competitive standard in that industry, that basically have workers paying all the costs of that asset working for free for a week, right? This is hugely important. Now that this particular case in California won't apply to these long haul truck drivers, but it's a broader issue that we need to take on. Clarification of what an employee is, so we're not tied up in court cases endlessly with, and then the companies, that's their terrain, because they've got more expensive lawyers who can just throw paperwork at you.
And that rule is why Uber and Lyft exists, right? That's the only reason, that's the only advantage they have.
Right. Steve, when you bring up that point in terms of the cost related to someone being misclassified and then turning into or making some sort of arrangement with that employer to purchase a truck, which in essence is some, long-term mortgage essentially that they're never going to find their way out of. In addition to that, so we see that cost burden on them, but you also mentioned earlier, and I think this drives back to a point that you were making, Doug, on misclassification of workers. An untrained or inexperienced driver related to a goal of reducing emissions. Can either one of you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I would just start by saying, we need to understand this stuff when we're thinking about policy that's going to clean up the trucking industry, right? I mean, if that's the situation, and we're going to, require that a whole bunch of new technology goes into these trucks to make them cleaner burning, we can't forget that it's going to be workers who are going to be paying for this. And so, that the impact of those policies on those misclassified workers means for long haul drivers that that truck payment every week is larger, which means they're much less likely to go home, right? Because if they stop working, they're not going to be able to overcome that overhead cost. And so, this is a direct consequence of the price of that truck, which has gone up a lot because of, cleaner engines and efficiency standards.
And I'll say, and I do want to hear Sheheryar. During the last wave of environmental regulations, we were part of something called the Coalition for Clean and Safe Ports. Some of the organizations were here in this, which brought together labor and environmental community and organizations on this analysis that we would never be able to clean up the fleets in any sustainable way in our ports as long as we have this independent contractor model. And the Port of LA and the Port of Oakland hired economists to look at what was the best model to be able to sustainably comply with the environmental regulations. And in both those ports, the economists came to the conclusion that you had to make people employees and you had to shift the cost off of the independent contractor onto the fleets that had the negotiating power to then pass that cost on to the cargo owners, the Walmarts, the Home Depots, everybody. And I want to personally thank the Port of Los Angeles that went out there and said, if you want to come onto our port, or if you want any subsidies, you have to hire your driver as an employee. And Oakland was about to do the same thing, but LA got sued. The National Resources Defense Council helped defend LA in the lawsuit, went all the way to the US Supreme Court, where LA lost under this F-quad-A federal preemption thing, going back to the deregulation. So I still think we had the right idea that you have to change the economic model if we're going to have clean air for people.
That's an important piece. Sheheryar, let's talk a little bit about the warehouse structure. This is all interconnected with movement of goods, freight, So can we talk a little bit about your work, subcontracting, third-party staffing agencies, no accountability to workers, workplace safety, low wages? And then I do want you to hit on one other piece that you mentioned that I thought resonated with me, which is this indirect source rule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our organization is a nonprofit worker center based in Southern California. We work primarily with the staffing agency employed temp worker population in the warehouse sector. And our organization is really based on a couple of core premises and concepts of what goods movement means and what it means in Southern California specifically. So 43% of the goods coming to the country come in through the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. A large percentage of those goods they're either translated onto rail or put into trucks that go into the Inland Empire region, which is an area that has, hundreds of millions of square feet of warehousing, well over 100,000 warehouse workers unloading those goods and moving them to be repalletized, moved out to the rest of the state or the country. Over $500 billion worth of freight is moved through that region every year, so over $500 billion worth of freight. Like I said, well over 100,000 workers are moving those goods, so it's a key part of our regional economy. And there's, I don't even know how many billions of dollars worth of infrastructure and capital that have been invested by both the state, the federal government, but also private companies, real estate, but also retailers to make that happen. So there's other hubs of goods movement around the country, Chicago, New Jersey, but there's nothing else like Southern California. Our premise is that this infrastructure has to be here, and so it has to be there in Southern California, that hub and that region is key to the way that capitalism is working right now, and that the retailers who are really the key players in this sector, the Amazons and Walmarts of the world, can afford to do things differently if held accountable to do so. And that Southern California is a place for that to happen. Part of it is that we potentially have critical mass to organize direct action and take action against those companies, but also that there's potentially regulatory atmosphere in California where we can call on these employers to do the right thing. That said, this isn't just transition of a dying sector like we've heard about in terms of some of these other narratives today. We're talking about just transition of a rising and really vigorous sector, goods movement that's changing rapidly, right? Goods movement is a sector, it's not an industry, it's just part of retail, it's just part of consumption. And so what we've seen is that they're very good at what they're doing and they're cutting edge in terms of separating their risks from their rewards. So they figured out how to benefit and profit rapidly from all these changes and benefit from subsidies and hold communities hostage and say, if you want these jobs, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And then the risks, the costs, they put on a subcontractor. They put on a staffing agency. They put on a third-party warehouse company that also is very big, but not nearly as big as Amazon or Walmart. And so that's a structure that's a structure we live in. That's why the workers in these warehouses are so hard to unionize. That's why we as a worker center are trying to figure out how to raise standards within those temp worker populations to both through direct action, organize those workers to take action, but also to figure out how regulatorily, in California specifically, to hold accountable the conditions on the ground to those retailers who are ultimately benefiting. So we've had strategic litigation where we've had Walmart held accountable for the conditions of temporary warehouse workers who were working in a warehouse that was operated by a third party. So Walmart was 2 steps removed, but we were able to get Walmart held accountable for those conditions for these workers who were being paid well less than $5 an hour, working sometimes up to 72 hours straight, waiting for their containers to show up 4 or 5 years ago in the biggest Walmart warehouse in the country. So those are the kinds of things that's kind of how we approach things. The same thing you could say of the port. If you look at the list of the trucking companies at the port, you'll never recognize any of them. They're often very small, quote unquote mom and pops. And those companies don't really have any power individually. Who has the power are the goods movement companies, the beneficial cargo owners, what we call them. whose stuff is getting moved. So I think there's kind of the goods movement sector, but we have to remember who's really making those decisions. And that's again, our perspective is we need to figure out how can we, both through like legalistic approaches, but also through debranding and through kind of, a lot of the lessons we've learned from the sweatshop movement around how to hold accountable employers who are using subcontracting strategically through more kind of media and street action. How do we bring those things together? So it's a theory. It's something we test often, but we're not where we want to be. So the warehouse sector is again a highly capitalized sector in our region, but well over a third of the workers are employed through staffing agencies that are close to minimum wage. Call in every morning to find out if you have work. If you get hurt, you're on your own. People don't know their rights, or if they do know their rights, they don't know what to do to access them. There's very little enforcement, health and safety, wage and hour rules, etc. So a lot of our work is kind of in that traditional worker-centered activity, but again, in a highly capitalized sector that's run by the richest people in the world. So it's again like, how do we hold them accountable, and actually often when we file a wage claim, it gets paid because these guys can afford to pay it. So that's a little bit how we approach things. So with regard to how that's playing out right now, what we're trying to do is look at what happened at the port with regard to litigation, with regard to how regulation of trucking could have worked and still could work. Most of the warehousing, so we're engaged with the warehouses, but also the trucking in our region, because those companies tend to be highly integrated with each other. Essentially, what we're seeing right now is we see an opportunity for there to be a transition from diesel to something else, right? The work at the port was mostly focused on emissions around air quality and not specifically thinking about climate, though that was a key part of it. I think now we need to be adding climate as a much more integrated part of how trucking changes in Southern California. And so the Southern California Air Quality Management District earlier this year established what's called an indirect source rule. Essentially, warehouses are not regulated currently, we're not regulated currently as polluters because it's just a box. There's no smokestack, there's nothing coming out of there. The trucks that it attracts, thousands of trucks per week often, are not considered part of that facility. So the indirect source rule says now they are, right? You're attracting this. You don't function without those trucks. And those trucks are keeping Southern California out of air quality compliance. We're on like day 85 or 86 straight in Southern California. They've been out of air quality compliance. It's like the longest time in about longest stretch in about 20 years. So the air quality issues in Southern California are rising, while in correlation with these truck emissions. What's the solution? Is it to focus specifically on trucks? We're looking at how do we raise it across the entire goods movement sector.
So what happened after that?
So the rule was voted on. Now we're in rulemaking process. So we're just getting started. So it's a really interesting opportunity because the Air Quality Management District is figuring out the options. And UPS is at the table, Amazon's at the table, Walmart's at the table, we're at the table. So we're trying to come up, the staff is coming up with options. And essentially what we're saying is, let's look at what happened at the port, right? These companies are very good at reducing their responsibility and taking the profits. Let's not put the cost of transitioning this fleet onto the drivers. Let's make sure that the players who actually have the resources and are actually benefiting from this region are the ones who are paying for the transition. And let's make sure it's a transition directly to electric, not this in-between transition to natural gas, which is something that they really want. And we saw at the port, the natural gas trucks actually don't work, they can't go up a hill. But the key is, how are we going to be able to find battery trucks that will be able to do that? And when, how do we actually create a situation where this is the cutting edge? Where again, Southern California is a key place, not just goods movement, but capitalism needs Southern California to be able to function the way it does. How do we move them to say, okay, we're going to be the first mover. We're going to invest in technology, not just invest in buying people, transitional natural gas trucks. But we're going to invest in developing technology in a way that'll leapfrog straight to electric. And that's the only way it's really going to change things, both on the air quality level, but also on the climate level. It's a huge fight because, you heard who's on the other side of the table. But that's what we're trying to do is, as Warehouse Worker Resource Center, this is our first real engagement in a deep way in these kinds of issues, and we're really kind of listening and following our environmental partners, the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice, as well as Sierra Club, Earth Justice, other groups that are really have been at this table for decades and are the ones who won this rule. Now we're at the table, we're saying, don't just say, oh, we're creating jobs, you can get away with that. Right? Like that's part of our role is to be able to mitigate that argument that like, oh, well, as long as we're creating jobs, all this other stuff doesn't matter. And to say, well, actually, our workers also have to breathe air. They also have to live on this planet, and the jobs aren't very good either, so maybe we should think about both of those things. So that's kind of, again, what we're in the midst of. It's really early. We're still, just getting started with this fight. There is an indirect source rule in the Central Valley that's kind of an interesting pilot version, but I think this is an opportunity for us to say, okay, this is what we can do in Southern California. And as labor, I think it's a question of like, how do we show up and not just say, okay, we're in solidarity, but like, how does this actually affect us? How do we make sure that workers are part of the voice of the conversation? So that's really what we're trying to figure out.
We filed the first lawsuit under the Central Valley indirect source rule.
Thank you.
Is there another question? Yeah.
Yes, you would.
Structurally, how would the ISR rule make sure that those costs are borne by the, I don't know if the right term is shipper or the retailers, the ones behind the
That's what we have to figure out. I think a container fee, that kind of thing, is one concept that's being looked at. Or again, like the original theory around the port was, that they have to really capitalize the reinvestment. That's something that's clearly not going to work on the legal basis. But what can we do to actually require that those fleets, an electric truck's going to cost a lot more than even a clean diesel. Those fleets are actually bought, and especially if there will be subsidies, just like there were at the port. Those subsidies go to good players, both environmentally, but also in terms of labor.
Right. Was there a hand back here?
Yes.
Go ahead.
1 and 2.
Go ahead, David.
Go ahead.
So I think you're off track in one respect, which is how are you dealing with the environmental impact events or climate impact? The fact that most of these warehouses will be dark warehouses where workers won't have to drive there or drive away because they'll all be automated. Somewhat like the problem of the autonomous vehicles. They'll still have the vehicles on the road, but they'll be more efficient to the extent that they'll have algorithms that'll tell the trucks where to go and how fast, and they won't have to rely upon human error. It seems to me ultimately that the development of all these freight brokers, UPS has one called, UPS has a broker they use to broker all the freight that they send on Kaoosji, it's called, Priority Logistics. So these companies are developing and controlling the freight and making it much more efficient to send it because the trucks aren't half full, they're now full. But I just want to address how the warehouse workers are dealing with the problem of no workers in the warehouses eventually. Autonomous trucks that are more efficient, which puts aside the question of whether they're electric or gas or diesel.
I think nobody has an answer to automation that, in terms of what's going to happen. I think building power to hold employers accountable to have some sort of transition into automation and have more of some sort of way that we can have some sort of revenue coming back from those who are benefiting from these regions, especially as employment goes down. I think that's going to come from building power. What we're trying to do is build power while we have workers, while they're able to take action. I think in terms of efficiency, I think that's fine, but that's not going to fix things. That's not going to change. I mean, this is a fundamentally unsustainable industry. It's capitalism, right? It's not, you can't consume at this level for much longer and sustain what we've got. So we're gonna have to, really think about what we've, what we're doing in a broader way. But what we want to do is build power. So I don't have answers for that, except we have to build power, especially while we still got workers inside warehouses.
David, I think that's, to me, probably the most important theme of this whole conference today was the question that Art Pulaski asked the panelist from Norway, which goes back to the breakdown in the social compact around work in this country. And I don't care whether you're talking about misclassification or subcontracting and joint employer liability or automation. To me, these are all schemes manufactured by employers to allow them to offshore the cost, to shift the cost burden onto the rest of us, but onto the workers and onto everybody in terms of the climate, and to extract greater and greater profit at the expense of the rest of us, whether it's worker power or climate. And that's why we're here today, is to try to see those links and how to build power together in the face of all of that.
On automation, I would suggest for the forthcoming, for foreseeable future, the next few decades, this is an area where we're looking at very strong job growth. Now the jobs are going to change, but what we're doing right now is we're taking billions of hours that Americans spend every week transporting themselves to a store and walking through the aisles and looking for the goods that they want. We're turning all of that into work, into jobs, in last mile and e-commerce delivery. We're seeing this in tremendous growth in warehousing work, and I, having studied the big box supply chain for a while and trucking in that, and now moving to e-commerce and seeing the difference in the warehouses, they're way more labor intensive. You can go into a Walmart facility that was moving stuff to supply their stores, very few workers, most of them sitting on forklifts, and they're moving pallets full of stuff in 40,000-pound bunches onto trucks. E-commerce, the supply chain looks completely different. If you go into one of these e-commerce fulfillment centers or the larger warehouses supplying those, you see lots of people moving stuff by hand, millions of items, and this stuff it's easy to have the information technology, and these I think are two things we need to distinguish. There's digitization of the freight transaction that brokers might do to sort of platform, put freight transactions onto a platform. That's very different than mechanizing the work. And so when you go in these warehouses, what you often see is there's lots of information technology, scanners and other things, but there are lots of variation in what people are moving around, and the best thing to do that is that you and I in hand. And so when you go in there, you're going to see a lot of people physically picking stuff up and putting it in bins. And anybody who's been in these, it's incredibly physical work. And so there's a cost of mechanizing that I think, can we envision a robot doing it? Yes. Is it going to be cost effective given the tasks? That's a longer term question, I think we're decades away from a shrinkage in the job, the labor force here. I mean, we're seeing spectacular growth in warehousing, and we're going to see it in last mile delivery too, for the coming decades.
That's really good. And then we had another question back here.
Oh, just quickly, you brought up the question of electric trucks, and with the driver in it, right? The driver driving an electric truck. I think that the technology is emerging, whether it's electric trucks or hydrogen trucks. But right, which technology is going to be the next one to prevail? But I was also wondering, within the ports, right, the automation has been electrification. And I'm just wondering, their argument is that the electric truck hasn't been invented that can, do the work that an autonomous vehicle can with its technology of the runway transducers, etc. Is that false? Is there?
I'm not an expert on these, you guys can jump in too, but I think no technology is ready until it's invested in, and often those technologies are invested in by the government. You look at a lot of the different technologies that we depend on, those came from massive investments from government based on public policy decisions. And those public policy decisions are made based on public political pressure. And so that's what our effort is to whatever that technology is, we need to invest in it, and it's not something that should have the market determine.
So Class 8 trucks are, they're not ready yet for operations. There are some fleets that are looking at it. But we have, the trucks themselves, the batteries are a big issue right now in terms of storage and cost, the capacity and cost. But we also have, quite big questions around how you charge them. So, these things are going to draw the equivalent of, a normal home's annual energy consumption in one charge. So, how do you supply, if you're going to have hundreds of those things, can the grid sustain it, right? So we have to think about generation, we have to think about charging times and facilities for that stuff, and so, Exelon and National Grid and all these companies are going to have to figure out, all that side of it. Ports are about as good of a situation as you could think of. For over-the-road trucking, it's a whole nother random pattern, sort of trucking. Electric trucks are still a long, long way off, for at least the heavy-duty trucks.
I want to go back to a point I think that was brought up by David, which is I think sometimes we are looking at information coming to us about these large distribution centers, Amazon type, that are heavily robotic. And then we're talking about other distribution centers that are very much more labor intensive due to this last mile kind of just-in-time delivery. So we really are talking about two different types of operations, right? Do either of you, maybe Sheheryar, have some insight to those two types of distribution centers?
Well, they're two parts of the same system.
Mm-hmm.
So they, especially as you move toward more kind of distributed e-commerce and stuff that's just one little package going to you, there's big, more automated facilities where stuff that's often the same product again and again and again is getting processed, but then the next facility it goes to after that is going to be a place where there's more workers, and then finally get to a facility where there's a driver who's literally driving at your house and getting out and putting it on your door. So they're part of the same system and often working with the same company.
Right. Deb, did you have another piece that you wanted to add on top of?
No, I mean, just, right now here in Northern California, we have stuff comes in through the Port of Oakland. It gets trucked over to the Central Valley to the warehouses and distribution centers where they break it down, and then they truck it back here to the Bay Area. And then for Amazon, they are UPS's largest customer, and so a Teamster will bring that package to the door. We worked with a lot of people in this room to move some of the warehousing and distribution to the Oakland Army base adjacent to the port, to get local hire in there, there are people in this room that are working on a high road training partnership to bring jobs to the local community with support from the state of California in trade and logistics. The thing is, that because of e-commerce, because of long haul, potentially platooning and introduction of new technology, unchecked, we are absolutely convinced, and if you don't agree, read Steve's report, that we could end up having a lot of these small Amazon-style hubs closer to urban areas where these new trucks cannot operate, And essentially what we could be creating is mini Port of Oakland, mini Port of LA Long Beach, with a whole bunch of little independent contractors running around. Instead of a UPS driver who makes $75,000 a year plus fully paid family health insurance and a pension, driving a clean truck that's paid for by UPS, that person will be driving around in their Ford Focus or their beat up, Chevy Malibu, belching smoke into the air and running around and parking in the neighborhood. And that is part of the scenario that we're dealing with here.
And that was without a prompt from me to tell him that's how we're wrapping this piece. It is 5:07, and unless we have any burning questions from the audience, I was going to ask any one of our three panelists to give us an update on two pieces of legislation, SB 1402, which is the Registry for Good Employers, and SB 1403, which is the Funds for Clean Trucks. So do we have any updates on those two pieces?
We're both sitting on the governor's desk. One bill, these are by Senator Ricardo Lara. If I could summarize it, Sheheryar should jump in. It's going to create a registry of trucking companies that the cargo owners, the beneficial cargo owners, the shippers can look at that list before they're contracting for somebody to move their goods through the Port of LA or Oakland. And if any of those companies have labor law violations, that's going to show up on the registry. And if they contract with any of those companies, and those companies have further labor law violations, they could be held jointly liable for that. Which gets back to this idea of trying to reestablish the compact here and making the people who are actually responsible for workers or for climate change pay.
What does the odds look like for governors?
With this governor, I never handicapped. But they both got to his desk with very strong support from the Democratic legislators. I mean, vast majority voted for both bills.
What are the numbers again?
SB 1402 and SB 1403. And really, it's also looking at the other point somebody made about tying subsidies for the next round of CARB regulations, being able to reward companies that are doing the right thing, investing in clean fleets, hiring their workers as employees, paying them a living wage. That's where the subsidies should go to, right? I think everybody in this room, in this conference would agree on that. Let's reward people who are doing the right thing.
That's right. That's right. Well, let me go ahead and wrap up and thank